Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Dairy Pod. I'm Ruairi McDonnell, National Feedbase Lead for Dairy Australia, and I'm joined here today by Phil Shannon, who's an experienced dairy farm business consultant from his own business, Shannon Farm Consulting in Northern Victoria. Phil, thanks for joining us.
No worries, Ruairi.
So we said we'd put together this podcast, Phil, on the back of some of the recent situations in the industry around rising input prices, especially around fuel and fertiliser, obviously driven by global events that are well outside the control of any of us here. There's some issues with fertiliser in particular, and the price of fertiliser has increased dramatically over the last two months or so, which everyone at this stage is well aware of. And we think that this is going to have a big impact on farm in terms of input prices. So we hope it's pretty short-lived, but it's probably likely to go on for a while. So we thought it would be worthwhile just having a chat around how, from a farm business perspective, you're going to manage this and how some of your clients and what you're seeing on the ground in terms of how people are managing this issue over the next few months and beyond. So yeah, I guess from your perspective, like how much of an impact have you seen on farm over the last few months, or what are the kind of trends you're currently seeing around this issue at the moment?
It's certainly going to have an impact. And as you said, I think it's alert, not alarmed at the moment is what I'm seeing mainly. So people are just going back over the basics of input costs and making sure that, with the reset in price, like say urea doubling in price, should they still use it and how much should they use? So it's just lifting their sense of awareness about the cost of inputs in relation to what they get back. And I think it's really important to understand that commercial reality will take place. Every time we see this shoot up in price, commercial reality says that the price probably won't come down when we think it should. So I think farmers need to prepare that we're going to be facing these higher costs for an extended period. And the bigger picture is it's mainly going to impact on, I would say, feed price. And that's what we're focusing on now is do we continue to purchase feed, grow feed and milk cows, or reduce cow numbers? And I'm hoping most people will be focused on using feed to keep producing milk.
Yeah, and obviously, as you say, you've got to do a good review, and every farm business is a bit unique. But we know that the price of fertiliser is probably at least double, if not more. You hear a lot of quotes of around $1,600-$1,700 a ton for urea from a position where it was probably $600-$800, before the war started. So that's quite obviously a significant uplift. A lot of farms in Victoria and beyond, actually all over the country, are using nitrogen fertiliser in reasonably large proportions. If we look at DFNP, we can see anything from 130, 140 kilos of N per hectare up to well over 200 and beyond on some farms. So it will have a significant impact, and it is a reasonable size line item in any dairy farm cost structure when you look at it. But how normally would you go about assessing whether it's the right decision to continue to apply at the higher amount versus maybe pulling back a bit? You mentioned about the opportunities you have there, or the choices you have there. You got culling cows, which is probably a last resort that we probably don't want to do, versus just paying a bit more to grow the extra feed and just continuing through. How would you go about kind of making that decision at an individual farm level?
Yeah, I'd probably always start with the context and the bigger picture, Ruairi, for an individual farm, and all farms are different. That's the way it is. It's just about understanding that we use inputs to generate outputs, and with economics, I usually talk to farmers, and most people do, about above the line and below the line economics. So the above the line is generally using variable inputs like grain, fertiliser to produce feed and produce milk to create a margin, and then that margin hopefully is big enough to cover what we call the unavoidable costs, sometimes wrongly called fixed costs. So that's servicing debt, paying rates, etc. So we don't want to get confused by the above the line and below the line economics. So if I go to your example of fertilizer, yeah, it's terrible. Fertilizer's doubled in cost, but if we don't focus on the marginal return from it, there's a risk that we'll be in a worse position. So yes, most farmers will make less profit than they would have made if fertilizer didn't go up. But the main question they should be focusing on, and the confidence they should have, is at what point should I stop using nitrogen to produce my own feed and swap for purchasing another feed source? And just as an example, Ruairi, I had a group of 30 or 40 farmers at the Western Districts yesterday. The average price they were still paying for urea was around 1,600 a tonne delivered. And we did a quick little exercise, quick and dirty, and that's all it needed to be. And most of them agreed that they were much better taking the opportunity now to use the nitrogen at a known price when responses are going to be reasonable, as long as we keep getting rain, rather than trying to go out to the market and secure that feed elsewhere. And in that context, Ruairi is also thinking about the future, going, well, I know I can use that urea now and get a certain response and have that feed in my system. If I don't use the urea, I don't know what the feed market will be like in spring. So it gives some kind of security around I'm dealing with the known rather than leaving it to deal with the unknown. And if I just touch on the fertilizer part, Ruairi, I usually split fertilizer into the two components, which is the nutrients that we bank, like phosphorus and potassium, and the nutrients that we need all the time. So we know we get a good response to nitrogen because it's usually the limiting factor. And so this is one of those years where if your budget was really tight, you want to separate them out and go, maybe from soil testing, I know I've got a really good bank of the P and the K. So I might not use as much of them. So that gives me a bit of cash flow pressure ease. But I still need to know how to do the economics on it. If I use N, what's the fee going to cost me from that marginal use of N? And as I said, the group yesterday, we went through the economics and most of them were still very confident they should continue to use N at their normal rates.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good to hear, Phil. I think, the point you made about the maintenance fertilizer, so your phosphorus, potassium, sulfur is important. There's a lot of, good other resources from Dairy Australia there that have been put forward recently on the website around getting the importance of soil testing right and making sure, as you said, if you can maybe make a saving on P or K where there's already excessive or adequate amounts of those nutrients on some paddocks, that's a potential cash flow saving that could be diverted into having extra nitrogen available. I suppose one of the big differences is the nitrogen is really only available here and now. You can't bank that. That's an important point versus the P and the K, which are and the sulfur, which are more medium to longer term investments in your soil. If I talk about, you often hear New Zealand farmers, they almost consider nitrogen as a supplement in many ways, when it's used just to grow extra feed here and now, or in the immediate kind of short term versus. So that's the kind of point you're making. It's basically the same choice you have. Like, am I better off growing that feed now versus getting it elsewhere, whether it's in hay or grain or whatever. Just one interesting comment that would have been interesting from the group you spoke to yesterday. Like, obviously, as we get through into June, July, the response rates to nitrogen will drop down a bit. So therefore, the price of the feed that you grow in that time of year when it's colder and darker and response rates are lower will be a little bit more. Is there a point there where you might consider saving a bit of nitrogen for springtime again when you get a higher amount? Or what would your thoughts be on that? I suppose it's an individual farm decision, is it?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It always follows the law of diminishing returns, Ruairi, and so the average farmer's a fairly smart user of nitrogen. So when we move into winter and the rotation's longer, the ground's colder, we're not going to grow as big a leaves, the response will get less. So at the moment, they might be applying it to most paddocks. They might do a much better assessment saying, hey, this is a For example, in the Western Districts, this paddock, there's a potential it'll get quite wet. So when I do go to graze it, I mightn't utilise as much of it because of the wet conditions. So it'd be a really smart move then to say, well, I'm not going to risk as much N there, but find paddocks that are higher and drier, better density, less weeds, and use a normal rate there. The farmers are smart. A lot of them already have this knowledge. It's just about cooling your heels a little bit and saying, hey, I know how to do this. I've now got a different fertilizer price, a different urea price. I just need to think through the process of, do I continue to use urea to grow my own feed, or is there a cheaper feed out there that I could use instead? I'd be really concerned, Ruairi, if anyone was at the stage saying, look, I think feed's going to be too expensive, I better get rid of some cows. That would really concern me if anyone was there.
Yeah, and interesting you make that point because, obviously that scenario would probably be the last resort. And that's not what we're hearing. There's pretty good confidence around, broadly around the industry, even though there's always going to be localized regions that might be facing more challenging conditions than others. But, a lot of places had a pretty decent spring last year and have a bank of probably more silage than they might have expected in a lot of the main dairying regions anyway, which is also helping to address the challenge that's in place from the higher fertilizer prices. It's also been in a lot of regions a reasonably good start to autumn. That's an important point too, Phil. I guess if we compare to this time last year in a lot of regions where autumn was pretty terrible, especially on these dryland farms in places like Western Victoria. So yeah, I guess it's important to acknowledge that point as well, that it's good seasonal conditions can more than compensate for potentially slightly higher input prices in some cases.
Yeah, and it's I imagine everyone's seeing the same. Is the fairly common discussion is I don't mind. Look, it's terrible. The fertilizer price has gone up, and that's robbed some profit from dairy businesses. But I was in the northeast the week before with business groups, and down in the west this week. Over at Gippsland the week before. The common thing is, fertilizer, the impact of fertilizer cost is nothing compared to this time last year when our farm was dry. So it's about getting it in context, and it's just to make sure I'm not condescending. It's terrible the farmers are going to lose some profit that we'd like to see them have, but they're in a much stronger position this year to have somewhere to put that fertilizer out. Whereas last year, lots of the regions at this time of the year were facing bigger decisions of, where am I going to get the feed from? Yeah. And on that route, it's good to follow through on too and say, hey, the dairy farming community, they got through last year and it was much more difficult. The dry conditions were really difficult. I remember going down to the Western Districts, dealing with farmers that were at the point of culling cows. And then we looked at feed price to milk price ratio. And we're in a new world now. It was really comforting to go, I know the feed price is really high, but you need to think about it in the context of what you're getting from that feed you put into those cows. And we've seen this step change in milk price, which has saved the industry, and it makes those decisions much easier. Once you start that process of destocking, the flow-on consequences are quite challenging because we all know that you destock. When you finally decide that you need to restock, everyone else wants to restock. So you sold cows at a low price, you've bought cows in, cash flow's tight, and it snowballs because you go, I just won't sell those coal cows. So now you've got more coal cows that you should have sold as genuine coals. You've got milk quality issues. You don't have the replacements coming through. So I suppose take a deep breath. It's much better than it was this time last year, and make sure we keep the context right for the impact of fuel and fertilizer on our systems.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Phil. I'm interested in delving a bit deeper into that milk to feed price ratio thing you just mentioned there. Obviously, that was always, I remember John Mulvaney talking about this several years ago, and it's been kind of a staple of kind of how we would assess a farm business and make decisions, or a key factor anyway that would be considered. But you mentioned a step change there. Can you just describe in a bit more detail? I think it's worthwhile going into this, even though it's more broader farm business performance stuff as opposed to directly related to the fertilizer and fuel issues at the moment. But around this milk price change versus the grain price, over the last couple of years compared to what used to be and what is it now? How much of a difference is that making to decisions that you make on farm around grain use? And then we'll talk a little bit about, knock-on effects around pasture utilization and feed base as well.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's clear now that we have had this step change in milk price, and we are seeing the response. So if we use Dairy Farm Monitor as just one example of some actual data, and we all, as consultants, we all have our own fairly strong database, we've seen this confidence that, we've got this milk price now. For example, it might be 75 cents a litre. Even if your purchase feed price is 50 cents, there's a reasonable change in the margin we're getting from the risk we take by purchasing feed from other people. And so we've seen this trend across the industry of farmers, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years when grain price has been really favourable, of farmers pushing their systems. And by that I mean they might have been feeding 1.5 tonne a cow or 1.8. Now they're feeding as much as they can because they are really confident that they're getting a good return from that input. And the only way they can use that input, more of that input, and get more output, milk, is to milk more cows. And there's inherently a risk in that, like if you've got a really wet farm. But the old days that you talked about, we used to be really, really careful, quite rightly, because our data showed us that if we didn't have about 60 to 70% homegrown feed, and that's the feed that was relatively cheap compared to milk price, that generated the high enough profit margin we needed to cover the unavoidable costs and manage our risk, we got into dangerous territory, and we saw farms that struggled because they became more of an intense farm. We've seen a strong trend over the last 5 years, Ruairi, especially in Dairy Farm Monitor, of cows using more grain, farmers using more grain confidently and getting higher production per cow. So there's a flow-on effect too of using more concentrate, because if you can use more concentrate and each cow's getting a little more concentrate, but over the 12 months they're getting a little less fodder, we can actually physically get more into the cow and get more out of the cow. And we're seeing that flow on. It's been a huge bonus for the dairy industry.
Yeah, and of course that's probably a slightly different scenario from, the traditional approach you mentioned there about really focusing on absolutely maxing out homegrown feed. But I think it's important to stress this point as well, that we're not saying that you shouldn't optimize your homegrown feed, your grazing management and conservation of surpluses and spraying, etc. Because the logical question is, if you're feeding a bit more grain, or there was a reasonable step change there on farms, and you don't increase cow numbers, or you have the same stocking rate as you always did, you run the risk of potentially wasting cheaper feed still. Is that something that's important to consider as well? If you just if you do the step change and feed a lot of extra grain without changing any of the other business settings around cow number, and sometimes there's other limiting factors on farms too. Like we saw, you and I were on a farm last week where there was a limit to the number of cows that could be milked through the dairy, for example. So there's a whole heap of other factors as well that are important to consider when you're considering making that kind of feeding system shift a little bit, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, Ruairi. There's 3 or 4 really, really good questions there. I'll try and unpack a few of them. Often, and we run a risk with a podcast because we don't have time to put the full context in, but usually when I say to people, the throwaway line, use more grain, don't ever use more grain if it creates waste. And so what we're seeing is this confidence of, we're moving away from potentially being totally focused on homegrown feed to manage the profit margin, to say, hey, the large margin we make from the cost of homegrown feed compared to the milk output is still critical to make sure we generate enough to cover our larger and ever increasing unavoidable costs in the business. So when you're going to use more grain, you don't simply increase grain, because all you'll get is that horrible word, I'll use it, substitution. It's not really so, it's just waste. So if a farmer says, hey, I haven't changed cow number fill, I haven't changed anything, I'm still grazing the same, but now I'm feeding 7 kilograms of grain, I can almost guarantee I'll just go out in the paddock and see wasted grass, which is wasted money. What they've done is chosen to use a feed that now might be 50 cents a kilo, and they've left behind in the paddock a feed that now has no value because it hasn't gone into the cow and made milk. So I just want to make sure the context is right. The smarter farmers are ones that are still very, very focused on making sure that everything they grow goes somewhere. And if they're using extra grain, the most challenging time is they want to use extra grain during spring, but they've already got plenty of grass. So if they don't shift their fodder conservation process to a really aggressive process of, if I just keep giving the cows as much grass as they need and give them 7 kilograms of grain, I will be going backwards. So we're seeing this combination of, again, I keep saying it, really smart farmers that have embraced this difference in this step change in milk price, and they're adding extra cows. You used the example last week, the farmer down in Gippsland at the Muster. He's two different farmers. One is leasing a farm and is milking as many cows as they can, and feeding a lot of grain because they've got a lot of cows, so they can eat all the grass. The other farmer is constrained by the dairy, so there's a limited number of cows. So their focus is more on conserving more feed and building a bank over time. So we just got to make sure that that message isn't just, oh, grain's cheap compared to milk price, let's just increase grain. It is still the fundamental of profit in farms to make the most of any homegrown feed that's available.
Yeah, no, that's I think a really good point. And you and I spoke long enough. I'm fairly passionate about focusing on pre and post grazing residuals and 2.5 to 3 leaves and all the basics of pasture management, which I think there is a lot of opportunity there to improve. Like, all we need to do is look at the DFMP data every year. There seems to be an extra ton or two available for utilized on the better farms, and everybody can achieve that purely through improved management. So there's opportunity all the time to improve. You're still striving to utilize, whether it's homegrown, as you said, and directly grazed, or conserved, homegrown and conserved. You're still trying to optimize them and max out that cheaper feed on the farm. So yeah, I think that's going to be an even bigger factor then as we go into spring. Just in terms of the you mentioned some of the other things that, if we get back on track a little bit towards the fuel and the fertilizer scenario. From the fuel perspective, we'll just touch on that. And I looked at some DFMP data, and it was around, I think, maybe 13, 14, 15 cents per kilo of milk solids in Victoria is generally spent on fuel. Like, are you seeing much kind of concern? Again, it's probably something out of control of a lot of farmers. Is the concern more around potential availability of fuel as opposed to increases in price, or is it just something that's a bit of a watching brief people are keeping? I mean, you have to use the diesel on the farm if your business is set up to use it. You can't really say, well, I'm not going to bother this week. What kind of approach are farmers taking in your groups in that?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's I tick it off because it's the low hanging fruit and it's the easiest one to have the discussion on, saying, tell me where you want to do the economics on when you're not going to use fuel for an activity. So if someone's got a mixer wagon, and that's their farming system and that's how they feed their cows, it's really unfortunate. This is why it's, we need to keep pushing the consumer to pay more for milk, because the farmers at the bottom end of the chain, and they're forced to use those inputs, and someone else keeps getting the output for the same price. So we're hoping that we can lobby fairly hard and get an increase in milk price. But if I get back to fuel, Ruairi, fuel's a necessary evil. As I say to farmers, it's terrible. You would have made more profit if fuel price didn't go up, but you'll make even less profit if you decide not to use fuel. So even when we get to spring and making decisions like topping, we'll do more economics. I'm sure DA will put more resources in by that stage to say, hey, let's carefully go through this process. What are the benefits of putting a little bit of fuel in the tractor and topping versus not topping? So I suppose my simple message around fuel is, alert, not alarmed. If you're in an area where you think supply might be tight, just try and get in good with your local supplier and keep your supply stocked up, just in case at some stage there is a little hiccup.
Yep, no, exactly, yeah. I think just you mentioned a concept there around margin over all feed costs per cow and calculating that out. And we often hear people talk about margin over feed costs, and they're just literally calculating the feed cost per cow, and that's it. How do you differentiate between those two things, and just back of the envelope, quick when you're on a farm? How do you calculate out that? Is it easy to calculate?
No, it's one of those things that it takes time, but it's the importance of the decision. So for a long time, I've been a less than favourable advocate of margin over feed costs. Look, we know it's misleading. I'll give you a classic of, I might have a group of farmers where I'm doing a monthly margin over feed costs. Some are irrigators and some are dry land. Which one do you think is going to have the largest margin? It's got nothing to do with, well, it doesn't give us useful information. Now, the bigger question we're usually asking, especially in this context, is should I continue to milk the number of cows that I'm milking? Because the biggest risk factor, I'm still convinced, in any dairy business is cow number, the controllable risk factor. Every time I decide to keep another cow for another 12 months, Ruairi, I've got to find another 6 to 8 tonne of feed. And feed's our biggest cost and our biggest risk exposure. So if I keep one more cow, I've got to find 6 more tonne out of the market somewhere, because I would assume I'm already using all my relatively cheap homegrown feed. So unless we go through to margin over all per cow costs, I think margin over feed costs is misleading. So this time of year, the process I would use with my groups and with the farmers I work with is, let's do a snapshot of, for the next 12 months, if you keep your whole herd, what's your margin over all per cow cost look like? And that gives us a ballpark, Ruairi, of, am I okay? Am I going to be able to cover all my unavoidable costs? And once we've done that figure and we're comfortable with it, then we look at the margin over all per cow costs for the truly marginal cow. So that's the cow where you say, actually, if I sold her, she'll be different to the others because she's a cow that will force me to buy in all the feed for her. So as you can see, it's not straightforward, but the logic is straightforward. So why I use margin over all per cow costs is because it's helping answer that really important question, which is, should I continue to purchase feed this year or should I exit a cow? See, margin over feed cost is just about today. It's really, I don't think it's helpful. I think it actually provides the wrong answer. A really good consultant prior to me taught me that margin over feed cost really is in economics. It's not about marginal feeding, it's average feeding. And it's not about profit because it's about today. Now, margin
there is
over
a hidden
per
cost
cow
there
costs,
with averaging.
Yes.
Isn't there?
Now that's me being pedantic, but that's my client base saying to me, hey, Phil, I want you to give me the answer I'm asking, not something else.
I think a good concept that you just said there is the last cow on the farm. If you've got a 500 cow herd and you make it 501 or 502 or 503, that's an extra 6.5, 7 tonne of feed that has to be found for the year.
Yeah.
And as you said, if you're doing a good job already and you're utilizing every blade of grass and every bit of homegrown feed that's already been produced on the farm, well, essentially you can consider that extra feed for that last cow purely bought in feed, or a mix of grain, and whether it's hay or silage or whatever that comes into the farm, and that can still be profitable. Of course, you want to find that point where that last cow is still a profitable cow, and you don't want to go beyond that into the unprofitable territory, I guess. In many ways, it's similar to the last kilogram of nitrogen being applied, or the last kilogram of grain being added on a daily basis. And in terms of when you're comfortable with herd size, we mentioned that. We've talked quite a bit about that. You need to focus now on maximizing where that feed. You focus on where the feed will come from, and obviously the first step is to optimize and max out how much you can get of the what you call relatively cheap feed, which is the stuff that's grown on the farm at home. So what are the basics there? I mean, I think a lot of people will know these, but I think it's worthwhile reinforcing these basic principles over the next few months around maxing out homegrown feed utilization.
Yeah, and this is a perfect chance to plug it, Ruairi. I'll be a little bit out there, like it's not the ABC, so I can plug stuff. As I think most of your listeners would know, I'm really passionate about feeding Pastures for Profit. It's a program I developed, in collaboration 25 years ago, and it's still growing strong. It's at the guts of how do we make money out of the land we've got? So the grazing concepts, the research is undeniable. So we have really clear grazing guidelines, especially for ryegrass. So if there's any farmer out there that isn't really aware of the grazing guidelines of graze at 2 to 3 leaf or canopy closure, a lot of farmers have been to FPFP in the past where we didn't emphasize as much canopy closure. Most grazings now will be taken at canopy closure because we've got better cultivars, we're using more fertilizer, we've got better winter growing conditions. So just for those out there, if you're not completely aware with canopy closure and how to measure it, that might be something this year that you really focus on. If I
So
come
just
back to
on
this,
that, Phil,
yep.
The canopy closure, that's essentially when no light's getting to the base of the sward. And in as you said, with the newer varieties, especially if quite a bit of nitrogen's been used, that can happen at 2 leaves or just around the 2 leaf mark, as opposed to maybe historically where we would wait to get out almost to 3 leaves, depending on the time of the year as well. I'm probably talking more about in springtime here now than in the middle of winter when the grass is growing a bit slower and the rotation length is quite a bit longer. But just describe exactly what you mean there by canopy closure for anyone who might not have been at an FPFP.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And I the classic I use is canopy closure is you can't see it from the laneway, because from the laneway all you're looking at is the top of the canopy. So the bottom you might be in canopy closure for 3 weeks and the top still looks beautiful and green. That's just the way the plant grows. So you've got to assess it in the paddock. Couple of quick steps, Ruairi, just for the podcast. Go into the paddock and have a look down at your feet, and if you can't see any ground below the canopy, you've got canopy closure. If you want to then measure how far you're into canopy closure, you open up that sward and lay the top leaves over the base of the pasture. And the further you're into canopy closure, the bigger the difference will be in the colour between the tips. The tips almost always stay dark green. If you put the tips over the base and the base is yellowing, you're in canopy closure. What that now means is the plant's going into a different mode. It's now in a mode where it says, I'm absorbing all the light I can at the top of the canopy. So the leaves at the bottom are dying. But 2 other really bad implications, Ruairi, that you can't see from the laneway is we're getting stem elongation. So the quality in the bottom of the pasture is dropping. So worst case scenario, cows don't eat it. If they do eat it, they'll be full of higher fibre, and so milk production will drop, and then we'll have to deal with the residual. And the other one is once we're in canopy closure, tillering reduces. And tillering's really important for the future density of that pasture. So this time of year is really critical because we put little seeds in the ground and we need those little seeds to tiller and tiller and tiller so they become a plant. And so if you're not really aware of canopy closure, it's a really good time of the year to go, hang on, that canopy closure thing, I thought I knew all about it. I better reassess.
Yeah, and it's funny because, out and about here, a lot of farmers will, not complain, but they'll maybe suggest that the modern ryegrass cultivars aren't lasting as long, especially perennial ryegrass. You have to go renovating the paddock every couple of years, a lot earlier than you might have done in the past. But as you made the point there, if you're not getting good tillering at this time of year, it's next autumn, next April or May, when you start looking at the pasture and it's all gappy and you're thinking, oh, I've got to go back and renovate it and spend another few $100s a hectare and take it out of the rotation for 2 months so it grows back. That's where the real cost is paid for that, almost in many cases. Grazing management has a huge impact on the persistence of your sward over several years. I think that's the key point that maybe isn't, and it isn't apparent immediately on the day there's maybe an error happens and residuals are left too high or pastures allowed to get too long and there's no light getting to the base or tillers are dying. But down the line, there's a good chance that that's going to cost you in terms of the long-term persistence of that pasture.
Yeah, because tillers is money. If you think about it, if you've got a tiller, which is a unit of ryegrass, that tiller has the potential to generate another tiller each grazing event, at least one more tiller. So if you think about it, this time of year, we've got seeds in the ground and we're trying to get density as quick as we can. We want each tiller to then have another tiller and another tiller. So a lot of the extra dry matter in a paddock comes from tillering. It's not just getting out to 2 to 3 leaf or canopy closure, it's the tillering. Just while we're on it, in case I forget, Rui, the biggest risk on most farms this time of year is overgrazing. So cows love fresh grass, and unfortunately, fresh grass, whether it's newly sown or not, it's green and soft all the way to the ground. So there's no guideline or barrier for the cow to stop grazing. So I talked about it with a group yesterday saying, I know it's a pain in the neck, but usually the first grazing of a pasture will have to be an on-off grazing because the cows don't know where to stop. And they've been on the feed pad, they finally get to see grass, and it's very easy. If you go in with your hand and you can grab that grass, and when you pull it hard, it tears off near ground level, that's what the cows are going to do. But we know that for the future of the plant, we need to try and leave a 4 to 6 centimetre residual. So this time of year, if you're going to use urea, that's relatively expensive, if you've overgrazed and have a short residual, then you're not going to get anywhere near the return from the urea you put on. So we can talk all we like about estimated responses to urea, but if farmers are out there overgrazing because they're unaware, it's all out of context. So I just can't stress enough to farmers that it's a challenging time of year. This is the time of year where you've really got to manage those residuals, particularly the first and early grazings, by on-off grazing. And one other thing I talked about with the group yesterday was the importance of staging feed if you can. So we're seeing this trend now of farmers coming out of the summer and feeding 7 and 8 and a couple of people yesterday, 10 kilograms of grain. And now they're going to go on to new pastures which have less fibre. And so staging of feed is far more important than it was years ago when they might have been feeding 2 or 3 kilos of grain and some forage, and then they're going to still get some forage and go down and graze a little bit of pasture. If they're now going to go out of the dairy with a gut full of grain, rapidly fermenting, and then into a fresh pasture that they're grazing down to the ground, a lot of that stuff that went in the mouth is going to come out of the backside, and the milkers won't like it, but it's just pure waste. So if you have the chance, I know it's extra work, but work equals money. It's extra work, but if you can hold the cows back after milking and give them some forage before they go to the paddock, the flow on in terms of farm profit and pasture utilisation are big returns. I still think that I keep encouraging people to come back and do FPFP again, come back and do that program so you're really entrenched on the bale. I can tell you the program's improved over time, and we just got to keep going back over those basics because that's still the biggest influence on profit in our business, Ruairi. It's homegrown feed. Yep. Every time that I grow my own feed, I've avoided having to go out into the marketplace to purchase it from someone else. It'll almost always be double the cost, if not more.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That point about the residuals there is probably the most important profit driver on a grazing dairy farm anyway, around the 4 to 6 centimeters. Nothing smashes new pasture more than absolutely grazing it down to the boards to 1 or 2 centimeters, and then it doesn't really matter what nitrogen you put on it. It's going to be a long time sitting there looking at it before it recovers a little tiny leaf. And so I think what you said there around the on-off grazing component, especially for newer pastures, is really key, and I think the other one there, you mentioned large amounts of grain. It can be a useful way to fill feed gaps, I suppose, at this time of year if you do have a shortage, feeding an extra bit of grain. But that's a bit of a nutritional thing there, looking at the overall content of the diet, trying to make sure there's enough fiber, or NDF as it's referred to, in the overall diet. As you said, the new ryegrass is going to be the most leafy, low NDF, very kind of digestible leaf of the whole, as it will be at any point throughout the year. So it's a bit scary if people are putting cows eating 10 kilos of grain straight out into that without any anything to buffer the cows. But in terms of,
and just on that, Ruairi, like it's again, the average farmer is really smart, but it's just thinking through this new process of, I have no issues. Like you just look at someone who's very clever and buys straight grain and adds canola meal. They've got a relatively cheap feed source, and there's little waste. So I have no hesitations with them really pushing that. And if that's what they've been doing during the summer, and then filling them up with, they've either got a mixer wagon or they're feeding forage, they've probably got a diet that's been working for them. There's a risk that all of a sudden they go from subclinical to clinical acidosis in a percentage of the herd if they don't just do that quick pre-planning going, hey, the girls are going to go down for the first time and eat a fresh pasture. Gee, I've just looked at it. It's really lush. Boy, I tell you what I should do is just take them over to the feed paddle, give them some forage, hold them back. Because what I'd hate to see, Ruairi, is people when we're under pressure, all of a sudden slip from subclinical acidosis into clinical acidosis for a percentage of the herd, because that could have a big long-term impact.
So Phil, we've covered a nice bit of ground there over the last while. I think there's some really interesting information and useful kind of concepts for farmers to think about there. What would you say is your overall final summary at this point for farmers to think about based on a lot of the stuff we've spoken about today?
I think alert, not alarmed is the main thing at the moment, Ruairi. It's focusing on what you can control. And this time of year, when we're starting new pastures, it's probably some key messages. Try and avoid overgrazing if you can. I would seriously hope that before anyone sold any good cows, you'll always get rid of cull cows. That's part of your system. But before anyone sold a productive cow, they sought some advice. I'm still looking at figures constantly that are showing that even as feed prices elevate, the milk price is quite strong. So please don't sell off cows because the consequence is they're too high. You've still got to put fuel in your tractor. Yes, it hurts because you're not going to make as much profit than you would have if the fuel price was lower, but we'll hope it comes back down at some stage. And think clearly about your fertiliser decisions. If you do need to compromise because of cash flow, I'd prefer you compromise on the bank of nutrient that you've got in the soil rather than the immediate use of N to grow additional feed.
Yeah, thanks very much, Phil. I think there's a lot of good practical advice there for people. Just want to say a big thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time, Phil, and it's always great to get that on the ground experience from someone who's directly working with a lot of clients and looking at a lot of farm business numbers on a regular basis. So really appreciate your time, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruairi.
So just a reminder to everyone, the Dairy Australia website has a really good fuel and fertiliser disruption webpage with a lot of good resources available on there. There's some good fact sheets around fertiliser response rates, importance of soil testing, some videos on a lot of other things that are practical and relevant at this time. So please check that out. And until next time, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.